When you're watching the best golfers in the world on the TV, you'll often appreciate that they have 14 opportunities in a round of golf, minus the par threes, to hit a driver off the tee. But how many times do you actually see them hit a driver off the tee? Depending on the golf course, it could be as little as 5 or 6 times a round. And certainly guys like Henrik Stenson, who has a super 3-wood who he really relies on, he's probably going to hit driver less than a handful of times on the golf course, and an awful lot of the time they're going to rely on a 3-wood hybrid club or long iron to keep the ball in play. Now, if you're struggling with your driver off the tee, it might be that you're considering dropping the driver down so you don't use it so many times. You're going to use a 3-wood or 5-wood more regularly to keep the ball in play. So let's have a look at the pros and the cons, the good bits and the bad bits of that decision. The first consideration for a lot of people with the driver is that it's less accurate than a wood or a fairway wood. Because the driver has the least amount of loft and has the longest shaft, when you get the ball curving off line, it curves off line for longer, and because it doesn't generate quite as much backspin as a fairway would, it will curve the ball further to the sides. If we're using a fairway wood, we get a little bit of a shorter shaft, that's easy to control. We get a little bit more loft, so that generates more backspin, that flies the ball a bit straighter. So it all sounds positive from a fairway wood perspective to start with. The consideration you've got to have is that the fairway wood won't fly as far. So let's make sure we're not trying to then hit this as far as we would do with a driver, because that's not the point. We're trying to hit this so it's more accurate, not so it's longer. One last consideration that I think a lot of people miss out on is a driver is the biggest club head. So it's easier to hit than a fairway wood in terms of the strike. So if you're struggling to keep the ball in play, even though you're striking the ball really well, dropping down might be the right decision. But if you're struggling to strike your driver well, changing to a 3-wood or 5-wood might be the worst decision, because that's the biggest head. If your driver's got a nice big head and a nice big tee-peg and you're still struggling to hit it, that's going to be really difficult. If you're going down to a 3-wood expecting you to hit the centre every time, well, look at the size of the club head, it's tiny compared to a driver. So you can only really use a 3-wood if you're really good at striking it and you're able to keep the ball in play a little bit more with the more lofted head. If that's then your consideration, we want a reasonable sized tee peg, so it's not too high. We don't want the ball teed up over the top of the club, but just half the ball level with the top of the club's perfect. A nice wide stance, ball sitting slightly forward in the stance, but not as far forward as we had with the driver. Then swing nice and smooth and easy. We don't want to have to try and hit that ball too hard. We're not trying to kill it and hit it as far as my driver. Now, I've hit that with a little bit of fading spin, a little bit out the heel of the club, not my best strike of the day. But the nature of the shot, because it has so much backspin, it curves up into play, lands just inside the line of the trees, and he's on the fairway. Now, it might only be 220, 230 down there compared to a driver that might be over 250, but it's in the fairway. That same shot with driver might have curved itself out into the trees. So consider how your fairway woods can aid accuracy. You'll lose a bit of distance, but just make sure you consider how difficult these are to strike compared to the driver with its bigger club head.